When a routine traffic stop escalates into a pivotal moment in a police officer's career, his deepest fears clash with an unexpected reality that he never anticipated. His target is the man who has the power to determine his fate. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon over the streets of Sacramento, casting the sky in anxious streaks of gold and amber. Terrence Washington hurried home after a grueling day at the office. His sedan hummed softly as he adjusted the air conditioning, a tightness in his chest as he tried to shake off the day's stress. The radio played faintly in the background, a barely there distraction from the chaotic city streets. He inched closer to the yellow light, heart racing as he slowed down just in time for it to turn red. That's when the blue and red lights flashed behind him, accompanied by the piercing sound of a police siren. Terrence quickly checked his rearview mirror, his brows knitting together in concern. He quickly pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down his window as a police cruiser came to a stop behind him. Out stepped Officer Scott Mercer, mid-30s, with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest, every movement sharp and deliberate. Mercer fidgeted with his belt as he approached Terrence's car, trying to project an air of confidence despite the unease bubbling beneath the surface. "License and registration," Mercer said sharply, his voice even but tinged with an underlying tension. Terrence nodded silently, his hand trembling slightly as he fumbled through the glove compartment for his registration, finally passing over his driver's license with a shaky grip. "Can you guess why I stopped you?" Mercer asked, leaning in closer to the window, his eyes darting around. "I'm not entirely sure," Terrence replied, his tone steady yet strained. "You didn't stop completely at the light," Mercer said, his voice faltering slightly. Terrence frowned, his nod barely perceptible. "I understand. I believed I had managed to slow down in time, but I get it now." Mercer hesitated before responding. Instead, he hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Terrence with an intensity that felt almost palpable. It had transformed from a simple stop into something much more significant, especially for Mercer. His posture shifted, subtly but noticeably, as if he had already concluded that this was more than just a minor infraction. The officer's eyes flickered to the license in his hand. "So, you're not local, huh?" he inquired. Terrence paused, his mind racing, before finally responding. "I relocated here just a few months back. The address is listed on the license." But Mercer seemed completely distracted. His questions were beginning to sharpen, hinting that he was no longer focused on a traffic violation. Terrence's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle him, and he leaned in closer. "Where were you rushing off to?" "Just heading home," Terrence replied. His tone remained steady, yet the slight change in the atmosphere was undeniable. Mercer no longer viewed Terrence merely as a driver. He noticed something unusual, something that raised doubts. Terrence could feel the pressure mounting, but he remained steadfast. Little did Officer Mercer know that the calm exterior was not a sign of naivety, but rather a carefully maintained facade of control. "This is only the start." Mercer hesitated, folding Terrence's documents with a careful, almost painstaking slowness before slipping them into his chest pocket. He straightened up, his expression shifting into something faintly smug, as if he had already decided what to think about the man sitting in front of him. "Step out of the car for me," Mercer commanded. Terrence's grip on the steering wheel tightened momentarily, yet his expression remained unreadable. "Is there a particular reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone tight. Mercer's lips twitched, but he concealed it almost immediately. "I need you to get out of the car, please. It's important to keep this as straightforward as possible." The threat lingered, unvoiced but undeniably present. Terrence took a deep breath and cautiously opened the door. As he stepped out, Mercer's eyes darted over him, assessing him intently. Terrence stood slightly taller than the officer, his shoulders broad, yet his demeanor was anything but threatening. His tailored suit suggested an almost overwhelming level of professionalism, and his polished shoes exuded a meticulous and intense attention to detail. Still, it felt as though none of that held any significance. Mercer pointed anxiously toward the front of the car. "Keep your hands visible." Terrence complied, his movements quick and uncertain. "Is there something particular you need, officer?" Mercer's lips twitched slightly, a hint of a smirk appearing. "It's just the usual process. We've experienced a few incidents in this area. One must always exercise caution." Terrence turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Mercer's with an intensity that felt almost electric. "Are there any reports of men in business suits driving sedans? What could that mean? Or is there something else at play here?" The question hit hard, and for a brief moment Mercer's composure wavered. He straightened up, his hand hovering near his belt, driven by instinct rather than need. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice sharp and unyielding. "I'm just asking a question," Terrence replied. There was no defiance in his voice, just a quiet firmness that seemed to make the officer uneasy. Mercer leaned in, his eyes sharp and focused. "You appear to have a surprising amount of knowledge about how this operates." "Do you have something you're not sharing?" Terrence allowed the silence to linger for a moment before responding. "No, officer. I really think it's important to be straightforward about why we're having this conversation. It's all about being open, you see." Mercer scoffed, his silence hanging heavily in the air. He stepped back, anxiously pacing a small circle in front of the car. The dynamic was changing in ways he couldn't fully understand. Terrence's response was far from what one would typically expect. There was only calmness, steady composure, and unwavering focus. Instead, there was control, poise, and an unnerving calm that made Mercer feel uneasy. "You seem pretty confident," Mercer muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like you have an idea of what might come next." Terrence held back, not taking the opportunity presented to him. Instead, he tilted his head just a bit. "Confidence is not the problem in this situation, officer. Respect is crucial." Mercer hesitated for a brief moment before turning back to face him. The smirk had vanished, replaced by a look that was more intense, almost on guard. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. Terrence's composure was unsettling him, and he found it uncomfortable. As the silence lingered, the atmosphere between them crackled, and Mercer began to understand that this was not going to unfold as he had anticipated. But instead of retreating, he intensified his efforts. The actual challenge was on the verge of starting. Mercer tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He felt unsteady facing a challenge, particularly from someone who resembled Terrence. His gaze darted back to the sedan as if he were desperately seeking a justification he hadn't been able to create. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Mercer said, his voice sharp and commanding. "I have to look for weapons." Terrence raised an eyebrow, his expression tight and uncertain. "Weapons?" he repeated, his tone shaky yet controlled. "Do I seem like the kind of person who would have a weapon on me?" Mercer's jaw tightened, and for a fleeting instant his composure faltered. "I really need you to understand this, so please listen carefully." Terrence paused, a brief flash of uncertainty crossing his face. Then, without a word, he abruptly turned and pressed his palms flat against the hood of his car. Mercer approached, the crunch of his boots on the asphalt shattering the fragile silence. The officer patted Terrence down in swift, abrupt motions, his hands hovering just a moment longer than required. It was more than merely a search. It felt like a calculated move, aimed at stirring something within, to elicit a response. But Terrence remained completely still, showing no sign of discomfort or reaction under the intense gaze. Mercer stepped back and whispered, "You're clean." The admission came out reluctantly, as if he was frustrated that he hadn't uncovered anything to support his doubts. Terrence turned to face him, his expression steady, yet his eyes were piercing. "Of course I am," he said, his voice barely steady. "Now, officer, if you could just finish up." Mercer interrupted, his voice growing increasingly intense. The words spilled out in a rush, revealing his struggle to maintain composure. It feels like you have a clear understanding of my limitations and possibilities. Could you please clarify the reason behind that?" Terrence folded his arms, his posture seemingly relaxed, yet an electric tension hung in the air between them. "I've experienced quite a few encounters with law enforcement," he said. "I've picked up quite a bit over the years." Mercer's eyes tightened with focus. "Is that really the case? Are you a lawyer or something?" Terrence offered a hesitant smile. Perhaps something else was at play. The uncertainty in his response appeared to agitate Mercer even more. He stepped closer, encroaching on Terrence's personal space, his voice lowering to a near growl. "Pay attention. Do you really believe you're more intelligent than I am? Do you really believe you can find a way to escape this situation?" Terrence met his gaze with a steady intensity, unwavering. "I really don't think anything, officer. I really believe in fairness, and at this point I'm really not noticing much of it here." The words lingered in the air, heavy with implication, and Mercer couldn't resist the temptation. "Is it really fair? Do you really believe this is about fairness? People like you often—" He halted suddenly, the words hanging in the air like smoke, even though they hadn't completely slipped away. Terrence's expression remained unchanged, but something about his posture changed. There was a subtle yet indisputable sense that he had understood exactly what Mercer had not said. "Do people actually like me?" Terrence repeated, his voice soft yet brimming with intensity. Mercer tensed, stepping back as if he had just recognized a boundary he couldn't undo. "You know what I mean," he muttered, his voice wavering, the earlier certainty slipping away. "I believe I do," Terrence responded softly. His calmness had shifted, no longer a mere facade. It sliced through the facade with a precision that left no room for doubt. "And I believe we both understand that this interaction has moved far beyond just a traffic violation at this point." Mercer opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to escape him. For the first time, he appeared hesitant, as if he didn't quite know what steps to take next. The shift in power was precarious, and for the first time, Mercer felt unsteady. However, the crucial moment was still to come, and it would be one he could never shake off. Terrence's voice shattered the oppressive silence, wavering yet resolute. "Officer, I believe it's crucial for you to understand my identity." Mercer's brows knitted tightly, a wave of irritation washing over him once more. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, but the slight tremor in his voice hinted at something more. Terrence reached into his pocket, his movements cautious and measured. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said, his voice steady, while his eyes remained fixed on Mercer's hand, which was nervously twitching near his holster. "There's no room for drama. I need you to understand it." The words lingered in the air, heavy with an unexpressed tension. Mercer's eyes darted to Terrence's hand as he pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. Terrence Washington spoke, his tone unnaturally light, as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Mercer stood still. His eyes flicked to the badge, then back to Terrence's face, desperately seeking any indication that this was a joke. But there was no humor in Terrence's expression, only a stern authority and a flicker of disappointment. "Internal Affairs," Mercer repeated, his voice trembling just a bit. "You're—" "Yes," Terrence interrupted, cutting him off before he could complete his thought. "I supervise officer behavior. I have to make sure that everyone with this badge maintains the integrity and values it stands for." Mercer's face drained of color, his once assured demeanor slipping away before everyone's eyes. He took a small step back, his hand slipping away from his belt as if the burden of his own authority had abruptly grown too overwhelming. Terrence stepped forward, narrowing the distance Mercer had instinctively put between them. "Are you aware of what has been the most unsettling aspect of this interaction, Officer Mercer?" he asked, his voice steady yet sharp. Mercer remained silent. He seemed to have suddenly found himself in a precarious situation, utterly unsure of how to escape. It's not the profiling, Terrence continued, even though that's already troubling. It's not the unfounded escalation either. The fact that you did all of this without knowing who you were talking to. You thought I wouldn't be aware of my rights, that I wouldn't grasp the laws you're obligated to uphold and the reasons behind them. Mercer opened his mouth, but silence filled the air. Terrence's gaze fixed on him, unwavering and intense. Since I didn't align with your perception of someone worthy of respect, Terrence took over for him. His words lacked anger, yet they bore the heavy burden of an accusation. And that's not merely an issue for me, officer. That's an issue for everyone you meet while wearing this uniform. Mercer's shoulders tensed, the heavy impact of Terrence's words pressing down on him. He stole another glance at the badge in Terrence's hand, as if it might vanish the moment he dared to look away. Terrence stepped back, allowing Mercer a brief moment to collect himself. But his voice remained sharp. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice tight with anticipation. You need to step back, return my documents, and consider your next words very carefully. Mercer's lips parted, but he hesitated, clearly weighing the decision to resist or give in. The delay proved detrimental to him. And then, Terrence added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, you'll definitely be hearing from me again. I won't be addressing you as a driver who is pulled over on the side of the road, but rather as the individual tasked with determining your eligibility for that badge. Mercer swallowed hard, his face flushing as the gravity of the moment pressed down on him. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Terrence's license and registration, his hands shaking a bit as he handed them over. Terrence grabbed them silently, slipping them into his wallet with a quick, anxious motion. He approached the driver's side door of his car, hesitating with one hand gripping the handle. He glanced over his shoulder, locking eyes with Mercer's for what felt like the final moment. Keep this in mind, Officer Mercer, Terrence said. The badge doesn't elevate you above anyone else. It puts you under pressure to meet everyone's expectations. As Terrence slid back into his car and started the engine, Mercer remained standing in the dimming light, his composure faltering and his future hanging in the balance. But for Terrence, this was just the beginning of something much more intense. His next move has the potential to reverberate throughout the entire department. The drive home was quiet, yet Terrence's mind raced with thoughts. The encounter replayed in his mind, not due to its uniqueness, but rather its all-too-familiar nature. Mercer wasn't the first officer Terrence had encountered in this way, and he was acutely aware he wouldn't be the last. But this time, everything felt uncertain. This time, Terrence was in a position to take action. The next morning, Terrence sat at his desk, the early sunlight streaming through the blinds of his office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, his mind racing with thoughts and uncertainties. A file lay open in front of him, the words on the page seeming to pulse with urgency. Officer Scott Mercer. His record had its flaws. Unresolved issues persist, including unprofessional conduct, frequent stops, and unclear misunderstandings. Terrence leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his mind racing with thoughts about the broader implications. Mercer was not an exception. He represented a sign of a more serious issue, and Terrence had no intention of merely covering up a grave injury. A sudden knock on his office door jolted him from his thoughts. His assistant, Alicia Turner, stepped in, clutching a stack of reports tightly. "Good morning, Mr. Washington. I have a summary of last month's misconduct cases. Additionally, Chief Michael Harrington asked me to remind you about the department review scheduled for next week." Terrence nodded, his hand slightly trembling as he took the files from her. "Thank you, Alicia. Could you please arrange a meeting with Chief Michael Harrington for this afternoon? I really need to talk to him about something important." Alicia paused, feeling the pressure in Terrence's voice. "Of course," she said, her voice barely steady, before slipping out of the room. Terrence shifted his gaze back to Mercer's file, but his mind was racing, fixating on more than just the officer. This felt larger than just one person and a single encounter. It was about the culture that enabled someone like Mercer to feel justified in his behavior, and if there was one thing Terrence was certain of, It was that culture began at the top. Later that afternoon, Terrence found himself sitting across from Chief Michael Harrington in a conference room, his heart racing with anticipation. Harrington, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, his posture tense as he listened intently to Terrence recount the traffic stop. "I might have dismissed it as just another unfortunate encounter," Terrence said, his voice firm yet unwavering. "However, that would have been an error. Mercer's behavior seems to be part of a larger pattern. It really shows just how much work lies ahead of us." Harrington rubbed his temples, his breath coming out in a slow, deliberate manner. He acknowledged that this isn't the first time Mercer's name has surfaced, but we've always managed it ourselves. Silently. "And that's the issue," Terrence replied. "Silence doesn't solve anything. Silence allows it to continue unfolding. It's time to make some noise." Harrington glanced at him, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The pressure of the conversation was evident on his face. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "A department-wide review," Terrence said, his voice slightly shaky, "not only concerning individual officers, but also regarding our training, our protocols, and our accountability systems. We can't continue to ignore this issue. If we fail to hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we possibly expect the community to trust us?" Harrington leaned forward, his hands tightly clasped on the table. "This is going to stir up some trouble." "Good," Terrence said, his voice tight. Finally, someone has taken action. The upcoming weeks felt like a chaotic blur of meetings, interviews, and reports. Terrence worked relentlessly, gathering data, engaging with officers, and conducting public forums to listen directly to the community. The Mercer incident emerged as a pivotal moment, compelling the department to face its shortcomings directly. Mercer, for his part, found himself in the midst of an internal hearing. Terrence openly displayed his involvement, sitting directly across from Mercer during the proceedings and observing as the officer fidgeted under the intense scrutiny. The hearing ended with a suspension, yet Terrence was acutely aware that the true triumph lay in not penalizing Mercer. Months later, Terrence found himself at the podium of a community event, facing a room filled with officers, city officials, and local residents. He spoke not of blame but of responsibility, emphasizing the urgent need for a shared duty to create a system that worked for everyone. His words felt like an urgent demand for accountability. They felt like a looming promise of change. "Justice isn't merely about catching the bad guys," Terrence said, his voice echoing nervously through the hall. "It's crucial to ensure that those entrusted with the duty to protect and serve uphold integrity, fairness, and respect for every individual they meet. That's the badge I believe in, and it's the one we're building here together." The applause was thunderous, yet Terrence hurried away from it. For him, this felt like just the beginning of something much more complicated. It felt like the start of something promising. As Terrence stepped down from the podium, he quickly scanned the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all intently focused on him. He understood that change wouldn't happen instantly, but it was inevitable. And for now, that felt like all I could handle. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who could benefit from it. Let's begin the discussions that truly count, the ones that can drive transformation. Please subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that inspire, motivate, and show what we can achieve when we fight for justice.